600 years before the birth of Christ, a man sat beside a river and watched the sky crack open. He was a priest, very far from home. The Babylonian Empire had taken him there in chains, along with tens of thousands of his people, after the sacking of Jerusalem. The temple was gone. The city was rubble. Everything he had built his life around had been erased. And then, a storm came in from the north. Not an ordinary storm. A great cloud, he would write, with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually. And in the midst of the fire, something like gleaming metal. Out of the cloud came 4 living creatures, wheels beneath them, sparkling like precious stones. A dome above them, like ice stretched across the sky. And above the dome, a throne. And on that throne, a figure. He didn't have the words for what he saw. 26 centuries later, neither do we. He described a wheel within a wheel, moving in any direction, without turning. You can read that as prophecy, as metaphor, as the vision of a traumatized man on the worst year of his life. Or you can read it in the same way a NASA engineer named Joseph Blumrich did in 1973, after his boss asked him to debunk it, and came away saying something very different. To understand what Ezekiel saw, you have to first understand what Ezekiel had already survived. The year is 593 BCE. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, has spent the last decade systematically dismantling the kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem has fallen. The Temple of Solomon, the center of Jewish religious and political identity, the house of God on earth, has been looted and destroyed. Ezekiel, a priest of that temple, had been marched to a settlement of exiles beside the Khabar Canal in what is now southern Iraq. He is probably in his 30s. He has lost everything except his training, and his training makes him a precise observer of the world, someone who records details, sequences, measurements. And when he writes like a man compiling a report. That matters, because what he writes next is not like anything in scripture.
A stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal.
Out of that fire, 4 living creatures, each had 4 faces. A human, lion, ox, eagle. Each had 4 wings. Beneath each creature, a wheel. The wheels are described as having a wheel inside them. The rims of the wheels are full of eyes. The creatures move in perfect unison, in any direction, and never turning. When they rise, the wheels rise with them. Above the creatures, an expanse, rigid, gleaming like crystal or ice. Above that expanse, a sound like rushing water, like thunder, like the voice of the Almighty. And above the sound, a throne, the color of sapphire. And above that throne, a figure in the likeness of a man, surrounded by fire and light like a rainbow. This is chapter 1 of the book of Ezekiel. And the rabbis were so unsettled by that, for centuries, they restricted who was allowed to read it. The Talmud calls it the Merkabah, the Chariot. Students under 30 weren't permitted to study it. Some sages said it should have never been written down at all. Their worry? That it made God physical, describable, almost, and this is the word that keeps coming up, pilotable. It's 1973. Erich von Däniken's Chariot of the Gods has sold millions of copies. The idea that ancient texts describe extraterrestrial visitors has gone from fringe speculation to mainstream bookshop phenomenon. It's showing up on talk shows, in universities, and now in living rooms. And at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, a senior systems design engineer named Joseph F. Blumrich is getting tired of hearing about it. Blumrich is not a crank. He helped design the Saturn V rocket, the machine that put human beings on the moon. We have a video on that and I'll link that in the description. He had patents, he has credentials, he has spent his career turning scientific principles into working machines. And when the ancient astronaut crowd starts claiming that Ezekiel's vision describes a spacecraft, his reaction is professional irritation. Right, he thinks, let me prove them wrong. So he opens the book of Ezekiel, and he starts working through it, system by system, structure by structure, the way an engineer analyzes a design. In 1974, Blumrich publishes the Spaceships of Ezekiel. In it, he produces technical drawings of what he believes Ezekiel was describing, a re-entry vehicle and landing craft so consistent with functional aerospace principles that he files a patent on one of the systems. He calls it the omnidirectional wheel, a wheel that can roll in any direction without pivoting, and it was inspired by Ezekiel's wheels within wheels. The patent is granted, and here is what he identifies, piece by piece. The four living creatures, Blumrich reads these as 4 rotor units, one mounted at each quadrant of the main vehicle. Their wings are rotor blades. Their perfectly synchronized directionless movement is consistent with a helicopter-style propulsion system operating as a unit. The faces, human, lion, ox, eagle, he leaves aside. Perhaps instrument panels, perhaps exhaust points, perhaps just the faces of machines seen through the eyes of a Bronze Age priest trying to describe the indescribable. The wheels within wheels. This is the detail that stopped aerospace engineers cold. Blumrich interprets them as wheels capable of rolling in any direction without steering, a gyroscopically stabilized system. The eyes on the rims are possibly sensors, or possibly the visual impression of a mechanism so complex it appears to be watching you. He patents exactly this design, and it works. The dome, a command module. The expanse above the creatures is a rigid structural element, a hull essentially, protecting whatever is inside from heat and pressure of re-entry. The fire, the lightning, the sound of rushing water. Blumrich's translation is direct. Rocket exhaust. The controlled burns of a landing sequence. The sound of engines operating under load. Now, is Blumrich right? Well, we'll come to that, but notice what he has done. He hasn't read Ezekiel as mythology. He hasn't read it as a metaphor. He's run it through an engineering framework and produced something internally consistent and something buildable. There are 4 theories, and because this channel takes honesty seriously, we're going to give them all a fair hearing. Theory 1. Ezekiel had a prophetic vision. This is what mainstream biblical scholarship says, and it isn't a weak position. Ezekiel is a prophet. Prophets have visions. The imagery he uses, the 4 faces, the wheels, the thrones, map closely onto the religious symbolism of his time and culture. The 4 creatures mirror the 4 cardinal directions. The wheels represent divine omnipresence. The eyes represents divine omniscience. The vision is theology expressed in the visual language of the ancient Near East. Theory 2. It was a natural phenomenon. The flat Babylonian plain is famous for spectacular atmospheric events. Ball lightning, lenticular clouds, unusual light refraction. A meteor striking in from the north, trailing fire and sound, could look very different to a 6th century BCE observer than it does on a physics worksheet. Theory 3. It was a psychotic episode. Ezekiel's visions are intense, repetitive and followed by long periods of what he described as stunned silence, sitting motionless for 7 days. Some researchers have suggested temporal lobe epilepsy or a severe dissociative episode triggered by the trauma of exile and the destruction of everything he held sacred. His descriptions do carry features of complex hallucination. Theory 4. He saw something physical, something that moved through the sky above the Khyber Canal, descended, made noise, and emitted light and left. Something that, had it been described by a US Navy pilot in 2004, would be filed as an unidentified aerial phenomenon. Theory 4 doesn't require you to believe in aliens. It doesn't require ancient astronauts or Anunnaki or a conspiracy spanning millennia. It only requires you to take seriously the possibility that Ezekiel was a careful, precise observer, which his own texts suggest he was, and that what he observed was real and anomalous. Here is the literary detail that keeps nagging at scholars who would prefer to dismiss all this. The book of Ezekiel doesn't read like mythology, it reads like a report. Myth is confident. The gods arrive and things happen. Seas part, fire falls, the earth shakes. Mythology doesn't hedge. Ezekiel hedges constantly. 3 full chapters struggle to describe the physical appearance of the thing. He reaches for analogies. It was like this, it had the appearance of that, something resembling the other. He uses the phrase something like more than 20 times in the opening chapters. Fast forward 26 centuries. In December 2017, the New York Times publishes a story that, in a quieter news cycle, might have changed everything. The US Department of Defense, it reveals, has been running a classified program called ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, specifically designed to study what military pirates were encountering in restricted airspace. What were they encountering? Objects with no visible propulsion, moving in any direction without turning, exceeding every known performance envelope, disappearing from radar mid-flight, sometimes described as disc-shaped or cylindrical, or in one striking account, like 2 concentric rings, one rotating within the other. In 2021, the US government released an official UAP task force report acknowledging 144 incidents that its analysts could not explain. In July 2023, David Grush, a former intelligence officer with full security clearances, testifies under oath before the House Oversight Committee that the United States government has retrieved craft of non-human origin, and that programs to study them have been concealed from congressional oversight for decades. We are not here to tell you these claims are true. We are here to note the question of unknown objects in our airspace is no longer a fringe one. It is a Senate subcommittee one. It has moved from the tinfoil hat to the Congressional record, and that changes the Ezekiel conversation. Not because it proves anything about what Ezekiel saw, but because it forces a question that was previously easy to dismiss. Is this new? If the phenomenon that pilots are encountering today has no satisfying conventional explanation, if it is genuinely anomalous, then it is at least worth asking how long has it been anomalous? Whether there are earlier records, whether those records might be sitting in plain sight, classified not by governments, but by the category of scripture. It is not new if humanity has been encountering these things for millennia, filtered through whatever worldview was available at the time. Then what would a sighting above the Khyber Canal in 593 BCE look like? It might look exactly like the book of Ezekiel. The Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic of ancient India, composed over centuries, reaching its final form around 400 CE, but drawing on much older oral tradition, contains detailed descriptions of vimanas, flying craft, metallic, capable of moving in all directions, associated with fire and sound. Some of the technical passages are specific enough that Indian nuclear physicist Dr. V. Raghavan spent 30 years arguing they reflected genuine aeronautical knowledge. His position remains controversial. It has also never been conclusively refuted. The Sumerian texts from the very civilization whose empire surrounded the exiles of Babylon describe the Anunnaki as beings who descended from the sky in craft associated with fire and wind. Zecharia Sitchin's translations of these texts are, to put it charitably, creative. But the raw imagery is real. The Sumerians were describing something coming down from the sky in a vehicle. That much is in the tablets. The Book of Enoch, a Jewish text that predates Ezekiel by centuries, excluded from most biblical canons, describes beings called the Watchers, non-human intelligences who descended to Earth, interacted with humans, taught them things they shouldn't have been taught, and were ultimately removed. And then there is the detail from Ezekiel that is easy to overlook. The vision doesn't happen once. In Chapter 3, the same object returns. In Chapter 8, it appears to transport him physically, or in spirit, to Jerusalem, while his body remains in Babylon. In Chapter 10, he watches it depart from the Temple Mount, rising upward and moving east. In Chapter 43, 20 years after the first encounter, it comes back again, entering the new temple from the east, the same direction that it left. And now it comes to the time where we have to debunk some things. We said we'd be fair, so here is fair. Blumrich's analysis, impressive as it is, runs into some real problems. The first is translation. The Hebrew of Ezekiel is notoriously unstable. Some of its vocabulary appears nowhere else in the entire Bible, which means scholars have no cross-reference to determine what certain words actually meant. The word open, translated as wheel, has a range of possible meanings. The word chasmal, the mysterious substance surrounding the throne figure, has been variously translated as amber, electrum, gleaming bronze, and fire. There is no consensus. Blumrich worked from a translated text of a text that scholars still argue over in the original. The second problem is cultural context. Ancient Near Eastern iconography is saturated with the imagery Ezekiel uses. Four-faced creatures, celestial chariots, wheels with eyes, divine beings surrounded by fire. All of this appears in Babylonian and Assyrian religious art that Ezekiel would have encountered in exile. He didn't arrive at these images from nowhere. He was surrounded by them. That doesn't make his vision less real, but it does mean we cannot treat the imagery as original, unprecedented, and therefore necessarily literal. These are fair objections. They deserve to be stated plainly. But here is the counter, and it is also fair. Symbolic and literal are not mutually exclusive. A vision can carry genuine theological meaning, and it also describes something real. A traumatized priest can have a genuine mystical experience that is simultaneously a real encounter with anomalous phenomena. Human beings have been overlaying meaning onto extraordinary experiences since before writing existed. That layering doesn't erase the experience underneath. The honest position is this: we don't know. The text is consistent with a spacecraft. It is also consistent with a vision. It is also consistent with an unusually dramatic thunderstorm seen by a man on the worst year of his life. In June 2023, NASA formed its first official UAP research panel. In July 2023, David Grush sat before Congress. In 2024, further hearings expanded the scope of official inquiry. For the first time in the modern era, senior American officials are on record refusing to rule out non-human intelligence. We are living, whether we find it exciting or terrifying, in an era of official uncertainty about what is in our skies. That changes what Ezekiel is. Not because the hearings prove anything about ancient prophecy, But because the window of the possible has been officially widened, the conversation has moved from science fiction to congressional testimony, and once that happens, the question of historical precedent becomes legitimate. If the phenomenon is real, if pilots are genuinely encountering objects that behave in ways our physics cannot yet explain, then it may not be new. It may have been happening for a very long time. And if it has been happening for a very long time, then ancient texts are not mythology to be patronized. They are data sets to be re-examined. The rabbis who locked the Merkabah away, who refused to let students read it without supervision, who treated it as the most dangerous chapter in all of Hebrew scripture, they were afraid of what it implied. That God had a vehicle, that the divine was, in some sense, physical, mechanical, traceable. They were right to be afraid. They just didn't know what they were actually afraid of. Ezekiel died in exile. He never made it home to Jerusalem. The Babylonian captivity lasted 70 years. He did not live to see its end. But his vision outlasted empires. It outlasted Babylon. It outlasted Rome. It became the engine of Jewish mysticism, a cornerstone of Christian theology, a source of inspiration for artists, poets, and philosophers across 2.5 millennia. And in 1974, it became a NASA engineer's patent application. Whatever Ezekiel saw beside the Khyber Canal, what came in from the north wrapped in fire and sound and light, it left a mark precise enough to survive 26 centuries of copying, translation, interpretation, and argument. Precise enough that a man who designed the Saturn V rockets could read it and say, "This is internally consistent. This makes engineering sense." We cannot tell you what Ezekiel saw. No one can. But we can follow the question across the centuries, from the ruins of Jerusalem to the Babylonian riverbank, from a drafting table in Huntsville to a Senate hearing in Washington. And notice that it keeps arriving at the same place. Something was in the sky. Something moved without turning, emitted fire and sound, and then left. Something that a trained, precise, highly literate man spent the rest of his life trying to describe. And something that all these years later came back.